I'm very happy to be talking about some research that I've been doing with Helen Orsoni Ladd, Steve Himmelt, and Mabzuna Tariva, who is a research associate at Duke, and I hope she's listening in right now. She was before, and so I think all the communications are.
And she was a co-author on the cross-state principles.
Right.
That's right.
Well,
So, so Chris Nordstrom raised the question in a few minutes ago about segregation, and it struck me that so many of the problems that we're dealing with here have to do with inequality across districts and inequality within districts. And there is a subject of school segregation, which touches on certainly the within and sometimes the across inequality, because we know associated with the segregation that we take for granted in the United States are profound differences in resources. And so it's, even though it sounds like a blast from the past to be talking about segregation, that's what we're doing. And our subject today is to look at segregation in North Carolina. We started off doing this only as a measure of measurement, and we wanted to say, how much are the schools segregated by race? And we also going to do by income, Corey. And we're using a free lunch data, but we had to stop at the time when the new regime came in. But it's mainly by race. And so that was our initial idea. But what I want to try out on you is something that, in my experience of looking at school segregation, which is a much longer history than you would even want to know about, is that not many people have looked behind the numbers and asked, why is segregation? Why does it exist? And why are some communities more racially segregated in their schools than others? And so we're going to try our hand at a little model, and there's no Greek in there at all. So I begin with, if I can figure out how to do this, it's going to go.
is it the? I think it's just
Right, oh, right here. Okay, good. All right. So the first. There are first two facts about North Carolina that are important. Is number one, that like other states, and this is not a slide that applies to this point, is that the state has embraced charter schools. So charter schools they're now about 170 in number, and whereas at the beginning of our time period, 1998, less than 1% of students were in charter schools. Now it's almost 5%. So charter schools have grown. And the other important background is the profound demographic change in the state of North Carolina. North Carolina is one of the so-called new destination states of immigration, and we have had a sizable increase in the number of Hispanic immigrants into our state. And so what you can see is the reflection of that in these two pie charts that show that in the gray area, some 2.6% of Hispanic of students in K-12 grades. By the way, we're using both public and private school enrollment, so they're all combined, and we're using as our basis for aggregation the county, of which there are 100 counties in North Carolina. This percentage of Hispanic students went from a little under 3% to almost 16% in this period of 18 years. And that is going to have a big shadow over everything else that we look at. In terms of the geography of this Hispanic increase, every single of the 100 counties experienced increases in the number of Hispanic students. And we see here the darkest areas, counties, are those that have more than 20% of their students are Hispanic or Latino. And then I want to turn to the question at hand, and that is segregation. What does segregation look like? Well, we're prepared to give you as many indices as you want. But let me just tell you, this is what segregation looks like in a county. This county is Chatham County. It's right in the center of the state. And it is 56% white in 2016, 16% Black, and 27% Hispanic. This is what segregation looks like in Chatham County. There are schools that are predominantly white. We have Bennett School, 90%, and a charter school, Chatham Charter, at almost 80% white. In the very same county, we have Siler City Elementary, 18% white. And we have Virginia Cross Elementary, which is a pretty new school, 6% white. Why would the county fathers and mothers want this to be the case? This is what we're talking about. Segregation is measured, as social scientists usually do, as unevenness in the distribution of certain groups, and we will look specifically at Black and Hispanic students, but begin by aggregating all non-white students and use the following measure of segregation. A fellow named James Coleman first used this measure of segregation, and in my work I've usually used it. The more common measure of segregation is the dissimilarity index. These are highly correlated at about 0.94. But what this is think of it as the gap between the actual exposure of white students to non-white students, and that's what the exposure number is. So on average, what percentage of the school is non-white? And what's the maximum that could be? If you balanced all the schools, it would be the percent non-white. That gap as a percentage of non-white percentage is our measure of segregation. So it's not a function of the racial composition itself. So if there's a single table that summarizes our results, it is this one. So what we have here is measures of segregation. Here I've multiplied everything by 100, so we just dropped the little decimal points. And the big takeaway, except for the picture, I liked what Rick said. This would be the picture of the whole talk, and I'll have one of those, but it won't be, maybe not quite as pretty. But for the one column that summarizes our results the most, it is the first column. For the state of North Carolina, the average white, non-white segregation index went from 0.15 to 0.19. Overall, segregation increased. What was going on here? Well, what was going on was that in contrast to the great muscular policy that the Supreme Court led from 1954 to the 1970s, the Supreme Court then got less enthusiastic about pushing racial balance, and then at some point said, you can't even do anything to advance racial balance if it means picking students by their race. So we're now in a period of complete laissez-faire, but there are still restrictions on discrimination. So what happens under those kind of circumstances? Because that's our new reality. What will happen to racial segregation in our country? So we have this one state to see what might be happening. In the urban areas of the state, there was an increase, but in the rural counties, there was no increase. Now, there's just two other columns there just to give you an example of what was going on in two districts. Well, the first one, they're both districts because these happen to be county-wide districts, as most of them are in North Carolina. In Mecklenburg County, Charlotte is the central city there. Segregation went up tremendously. During this period, as we have looked at in other of our research, it was because, in large part, the district decided, no longer under pressure from federal courts, to allow much more freedom in choosing schools, and that allowed families to take their children to neighborhood schools. So the segregation index went up. The other county I'm showing you is the county that I showed you the pictures of, and there it's this is counted as a rural county, even though it does have a couple of cities there and is growing very rapidly. Its segregation index went up as well. We did one thing before I get to our picture, and that is we looked at the metropolitan areas of the state, of which there are 13, and we said, can we decompose, split up the total segregation into the components that you could assign responsibility for? How much, for example, is segregation the result of the fact that you've got private schools that are predominantly white? Or to what extent is segregation due to the fact that charter schools might be disproportionately white, as we have found in our previous research over the last few years? How much does it add up? Or is it like the rest of at least the industrialized part of the country, where most segregation is because of differences between district jurisdictions, especially in the Northeast and Midwest, where these metro areas are balkanized into lots of jurisdictions? That's where segregation happens. But a state like North Carolina with very large districts, you wouldn't expect that much. Well, what you find is that in, let's just take Charlotte, the second line there, the total segregation rate for the metropolitan area of Charlotte, only the North Carolina counties of that, is mostly due to differences between schools within districts, and that would count Gaston County, that would count Union County, and it would also be Charlotte-Mecklenburg and probably Cabarrus. So the between district segregation, that's the next to last column. This is the one that would drive the segregation of Chicago and Detroit. In North Carolina, it's not as big because the districts are so large. The middle column has to do with charter schools, and you see for the 13 districts of metro areas, only about 2% is due to that, but in Durham, our home, it is 6%. So I think I've got about 6 minutes or so. Is that right? 5. Okay. So let me then turn to something that goes beyond white, non-white, and this is where we get to the question of, can we explain what's going on? Here is I give this to you with some trepidation, but what we've said, let's see whether whites might have a different response to interracial contact with Hispanic students as against Black students. And what we see is that on the right-hand side, that just take the top 3 bars for the state of North Carolina, see that segregation for white Hispanic segregation was much lower than white-Black segregation, but it also was the case that there weren't that many Hispanic students. So what we attempted to do, and this will be the last picture, is we have attempted to put together the following simple model. And follow me and see if you think this makes sense. Our sense is that the leadership in each county is probably predominantly white in most counties, and that leadership has several objectives. But one of those objectives is to limit the exposure of white children to groups of non-white children. They might have different preferences for Blacks and Hispanics. And we measure that in terms of this exposure rate. The problem that the white leadership has is to balance its desire to limit interracial exposure against the inconvenience of doing it. If you wanted to separate the races entirely in a county like Chatham, you could do it, but at tremendous cost, and probably it would be challenged by the courts because there's such an expanse. So what we find is that we will look for differences. We'll try to explain differences in segregation on 3 bases. One is differences between whites' reaction to Hispanic versus Black. That would be one. Second the more there are of this non-white group, the harder it's going to be to maintain a low exposure rate. So the more of those there are, the higher the segregation rate is. And the third thing is, the easier it will be to reduce this interracial exposure if there were more districts per county, or if the county is very dense, it's going to be easier to do that is going to be an effect. So what we did was to estimate nonlinear equations, which basically have segregation on the left-hand side. There's a transformation of it called a log of odds, but that's on the left-hand side. And on the right-hand side, a nonlinear function of density and racial composition, and then whether there are more districts than one. And we get finally to the last Hanashek picture, and this is what we have. So to summarize our results, we find that all of these explain or show the level of segregation, either white black or white Hispanic, and we have a pair for each one in a typical dense county, those are the top two lines, or one in a typical non-dense county, call it a rural county. So if we just look at the top two lines, the very top one is a dark dotted line, which predicts the segregation rate as a function of the percent black in the county, when percent black is black divided by black plus white. So basically we are forgetting everybody else, and we're only doing a pair of comparisons. What you see is that at every level of racial composition, the white leadership has chosen, through a combination of mechanisms, to segregate themselves versus African Americans at a greater rate than they would had there been, the shoe had been on the Hispanic foot. However, in the rural areas, it's a reverse story. And the bottom two areas again show our assumed rightward increase, but over most areas, for a given racial composition, the leadership that we are presuming is in charge is choosing to segregate themselves away from Hispanic children as compared to black children. The backstory is places like Chatham County. Where are these Hispanic students gravitating to? To little clusters close to meat packing factories in Chatham County and Sampson County. It's a different kind of meat, but there are also factories. And so part of the story is going to be residential segregation, and we're still working on exactly how to incorporate that. So that's our story. Segregation is increasing, and we think that a model that explains it has to do with white decisions about interracial contact. Thank you.